Tonight, we step into the unknown, a place between waking and dreaming, where stories whisper in the dark. Let the shadows stretch. Allow your mind to drift beyond the edges of reality. Close your eyes. The journey begins now.
Some places vanish from memory, not because they've been destroyed or because they've been abandoned, but because something wants them to be forgotten. And yet, for those who go looking, they can still be found. Tonight, we go to one of those places. A building no one speaks of, standing empty like a cigarette burn in the city's silhouette. A place where the past lingers and the future never arrives. Welcome to Halcyon Tower. Chapter 1. The First Call. The rain had been falling for hours. It came down in slow, deliberate sheets, washing the city in a dull, endless rhythm. It tapped against the window beside me, collecting in long streaks down the glass, warping the neon glow from the liquor store across the street. Inside, my office was dim, just a desk lamp throwing weak light over stacks of paper, with half-filled ashtrays, and a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. The walls were lined with old case files, missing persons, fraud, the occasional infidelity job, work that paid the bills but didn't do much else. I had told myself I'd call it a night, but sleep never came easy, and the longer I sat there, the heavier the city felt, like it was waiting for something. My name is Ethan Cross. Once, I was a crime reporter, writing stories about the city's worst. But after enough years of printing other people's tragedies, you start seeing ghosts everywhere. You write about a dead girl in the morning, and by sunset you swear you saw her reflection in a subway window. So I quit. Now I work cases that don't make headlines, the ones no one looks for or cares to read about. And in my experience, when a person goes missing, they don't always leave. Sometimes they just slip out of sight. The phone rang at 2:14 a.m. It startled me out of my thoughts, the old landline rattling against a half-empty bottle of whiskey. I stared at it for a moment. Late calls never meant good news, but something about this one felt off. I reached for the receiver and brought it to my ear. "Hello, you've reached Cross." For a second, silence. Then, beneath the hum of dead air, a voice, a whisper, buried under static. "She's still alive, but not for long." And then click. I sat there, listening to the dial tone, trying to place the voice. It had been low, distorted, and hollow, like a recording played through broken speakers. I replayed the words in my head. She's still alive, but not for long. Who was still alive, and who was running out of time? That's when I heard it. Not the static, something else, buried deep in the background of the call. At first it was faint, just a soft, rhythmic chime, but the longer I sat there, the more certain I became. It was the sound of an elevator bell, an old one. The kind you don't hear in modern buildings anymore. The kind that groans its way up, floor by floor, the doors grinding open like a mouth that doesn't want to speak. And I knew exactly where I had heard it before. It was at Halcyon Tower. Halcyon Tower. The name alone made my skin crawl. Once it had been a luxury high-rise, a place for the city's elite to live above it all. The kind of building where the walls were too clean, the carpets too soft, and the windows too large to ever feel safe. Then came the fire. They said it started on the top floors. It spread too fast. The alarms never went off. By the time the first responders arrived, half the tower was gone, and those who were still inside never left. After the fire, no one rebuilt the building. No one tore it down. It just stood there, empty, a hollow shell in the skyline. Most people had forgotten about it, or maybe they just wanted to forget. But every so often you'd hear stories, a light flickering in one of the upper windows, a shadow moving in a place no one lived. And then there were the ones who went inside. Kids, mostly, daring each other to sneak in to see if they could make it to the 32nd floor where the fire had been at its worst. Some of them made it back out. Others didn't. And the ones who did, they never talked about what they saw. I looked at the phone. Whoever had called me, whoever had whispered those words into the receiver, had done it from inside that building. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing a hand over my jaw, told myself I should let it go, that it was probably a prank, a wrong number, but deep down I already knew it wasn't. I grabbed my coat and checked my gun, not that I expected to use it. Half the time, just having it made me feel better. I threw back the last of my coffee, barely tasting it. Then I stood, rolling the stiffness from my shoulders, and walked to the window. The rain hadn't let up. It painted the city in streaks of light, turning the street below into a blurred, shimmering reflection of something half awake. And in the distance, just barely visible between the buildings, was the silhouette of Halcyon Tower. Dark, waiting. I should have let it go, but I didn't. Chapter 2. The Tower. I took the long way. Not because I was stalling. At least that's what I told myself. I drove with the window cracked just enough to let the scent of rain inside. The city was half asleep, the streets slick with water, headlights gliding over empty sidewalks. I watched the city roll by in pieces. The old diner on 4th where the coffee was always burnt. The pawn shop on Lexington, its windows full of things people never came back for. The overpass where a man once told me, some doors don't open, some doors don't close. I should have listened to him. I took a turn onto Haven Street, and there it was, Halcyon Tower. Even in the dark it loomed, 32 stories of dead windows reflecting nothing. No power, no tenants. It should have felt empty, but it didn't. It felt like something was watching, waiting. I pulled up 2 blocks away, cutting the engine, and I sat there a moment, letting the rain tap against the roof. Told myself I could still turn back. Then I grabbed my coat and stepped out. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt. The city had a rhythm, like a steady pulse of a place that never truly slept. But here the sound just died, like the building swallowed it whole. The front doors stood closed. The glass was coated in dust, streaked with old rain, but I could still make out the faint lettering etched above them. Halcyon Tower, established 1974. Once, people had walked in and out of here every day. Now I was the only one, or at least I should have been. The doors weren't locked. I pulled one open, and the air inside hit me all at once. It was cold, stale, and motionless. It was like stepping into a room where someone had died and no one had ever come to clean it out. The lobby was vast, its ceiling high enough to vanish into darkness. Chandeliers hung overhead like skeletons of dead stars. The once polished marble floors were cracked, covered in dust and forgotten footprints. A long, empty reception desk stretched across the back wall. The chairs in the waiting area were still arranged in neat little clusters, untouched for years. I ran a hand over the counter. The dust smeared. No one had been here for a long time, and yet the elevator doors were open, waiting. I hesitated, then stepped forward. Inside, the walls were lined with mirrored panels, clouded with age. My reflection followed me, distorted and stretched. The buttons were worn, the numbers barely visible beneath years of grime. I reached for 16, but I never touched it. Because the moment I stepped inside, the doors slid shut, and the elevator began to move. I hadn't pressed anything, but I was going up. I watched the numbers blink above the doors. Something about the motion felt wrong, like the elevator wasn't lifting me up, but rather pulling me in. Somewhere between floors, I heard it, a whisper. It was soft, and it was right behind me. "Run," it said. I quickly turned around. There was nothing there, just my reflection in the mirrored walls. And yet, the air felt different. It felt charged, as if something had just left. The elevator jerked to a stop. I nearly lost my footing. The old cables groaned, metal grinding somewhere far above. The doors slid open, floor 16. A long hallway stretched before me, lined with doors. The wallpaper was faded, peeling in long, curling strips. The carpet smelled damp, like old rain soaked too deep to dry. Every door was closed, except one. At the very end of the hall, 1603, the door was slightly ajar, just enough to see inside. Just enough to see someone standing there, watching me. The light inside the room was dim, a single lamp on the nightstand flickering weakly. The figure in the room was a woman. Dark hair, pale skin. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there. I stepped inside. The air was thick, charged, and electric. A rotary phone sat on the nightstand. The receiver was off the hook. A humming dial tone buzzed from the speaker. The woman tilted her head. Then she raised a finger to her lips, a silent warning, and the phone went dead. I should have walked away, but something told me it was already too late. Chapter 3: The Visitor. I stood at the threshold of room 1603. The door had been left slightly ajar. The woman was silent, standing just beyond the reach of the flickering lamp. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. She just watched. Or maybe she listened. I hesitated. Everything about this felt wrong. Not like a crime scene. Not like a trap. Something else. Something older. A soft, electric pulse ran through the air, raising the hairs along my arms. Slowly, I exhaled, then pushed the door open. The air was heavy, thick with dust and silence. A single lamp sat on the nightstand, casting flickering light against the faded wallpaper. The bed was still made. The furniture was covered in sheets, as if someone had left in a hurry but expected to return. And yet there was no sign of life, no bags, no clothes, no personal belongings. I took a slow step inside. The woman didn't move. She didn't speak. She just watched, like a figure in a photograph, like something waiting for a moment to be remembered. "Why did you call me?" I asked, keeping my voice low. She gave no response. "You said she was still alive, but not for long." There was more silence, but her head tilted slightly, just enough to make me uneasy, like she was listening for something beyond my voice, like she was waiting. The shadows stretched long across the floor, the dim glow of the lamp flickering against the nightstand. Then, finally, she spoke in a whisper. "You shouldn't have come." Her voice was light, almost fragile, but there was something off about it, something distant, like it wasn't entirely her own. "Who are you?" I asked. Her gaze flickered, not at me, but toward the door, like she expected someone else, or as if someone was already here. I followed her gaze. The hallway outside was empty. At least I thought it was. I turned back to her, and she took a slow step backward, retreating into the shadows. And as she moved, the light from the lamp barely touched her. The rotary phone on the nightstand let out a soft click. The hum of the dial tone cut out. For a moment, just silence. Then a whisper, but not from her. From the phone. I leaned in slowly. The voice on the line was too soft to make out, a steady murmur, like someone speaking just beyond the reach of understanding. But there was something familiar about it. Something that made my stomach tighten. The sound of someone breathing, a long, slow inhale. Then the words were spoken. "Don't let him in." My skin went cold. I turned back toward the woman. She was gone. I stepped toward the door, listening. Everything felt wrong now, like the room was holding its breath. The hallway beyond the door stretched out, long and empty. The peeling wallpaper seemed darker now, and the air was heavier. And then I saw it. At the far end of the hall, a figure. Standing motionless, it was facing me. No features and no face. It was tall, still, and was waiting. The woman's whisper echoed in my mind. "Don't let him in." The figure didn't move, but the hallway felt shorter now, like the space between us had shrunk as if he had been closer before I noticed. I took a step back and the boards beneath my feet groaned. At that point, I saw it, the door to room 1605 just across the hall. It was open now. It hadn't been a second ago. Then a sound, soft and gentle, almost polite. A knock. Not at my door, but the door to room 1605. But the room was empty. The figure at the end of the hallway didn't move, didn't flinch. But the knock came again. It was slow and deliberate. And then I saw the shadow. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't from the figure at the end of the hall, but something else, and it was spilling out from the doorway of room 1605. The shadow was long and stretched too far and too thin. I felt my breath catch. My heartbeat erupted in my ears. The woman's whisper echoed again. "Don't let him in." Then the doorknob to room 1605 turned, and the door began to open. I should have left, but something told me it was already too late. Chapter 4. The door opens. I stood there, silent, watching, and across the hall, the door to room 1605 was opening. I hadn't touched it. No one had. And yet the door was moving on its own, inching open with a long, slow groan, like something heavy pressed against the other side. The hallway felt tighter now, like the air itself had begun to close in. A feeling curled in my stomach, ancient and instinctual, something telling me, don't look inside, don't let it in. But my feet wouldn't move, and I could already see just beyond the threshold, darkness. Not empty, not the kind of dark you find in a forgotten room. This was something else, something much more thick and deep, a blackness that felt like if you stepped into it, you wouldn't step out again. And then out of that darkness, a shape. Not a person, not exactly. A silhouette, tall and unnatural, like a shadow that had peeled itself from the wall. It didn't step forward. It unfolded, slow and deliberate, like a marionette waking for the first time. And I realized with a slow, creeping horror, it had been standing there the whole time, waiting and watching, a shadow without a source. And as I stared, I felt something staring back. Then a sound. It was soft at first, like a breath on cold glass. Not words, not exactly, but an impression of words, like a whisper being spoken just outside the range of hearing. A voice saying something that I shouldn't understand, but somehow did. "You're late," it said. A cold wave passed through me, as if the air had shifted backward, reversing into something old, something wrong. I blinked and saw that the shadow was closer now. No sound, no movement, but it was closer. The woman's words whispered in my mind. "Don't let him in." I forced myself to move, to step back, to close the door, and to end this. But the moment my foot pressed against the floor, the figure lifted a hand and knocked against the inside of the open door. That's when I felt it. The moment something shifted, like a thread had been pulled from the wrong place in a web. It's as if I had been a step ahead, and now I was 3 steps behind. Because now the door was open, and now he was inside. I didn't look because I couldn't, because something inside me knew the truth. If I looked now, if I really saw him, I wouldn't wake up. Not just from this, but from anything. Because he wasn't just inside the room, he was behind me. I swallowed hard, while every nerve in my body screamed for me to run, to leave. But my legs wouldn't move, and then the light flickered, and in that split second of darkness, the room around me changed. Suddenly I wasn't standing in room 1603 anymore. The walls stretched, flickered, the bed was gone, the lamp was gone, and the rotary phone on the nightstand also gone. Instead, I was in a hallway. The walls were clean now, the floors polished, and the building, it wasn't abandoned. Somewhere in the distance I heard footsteps and voices, a door opening down the hall. For a moment, just a moment, Halcyon Tower was alive again. I turned, my pulse hammering. The hallway stretched long and impossible, and at the end of it an elevator, waiting, open. And inside of it the woman from room 1603. Her dark hair was different, a bit shorter. Her clothes were more modern, more real, and she wasn't looking at me. Instead, she was looking past me, at him, at the thing standing behind me. And then she raised her hand, not a wave and not a greeting, but a warning. I tried to turn, to look behind me and to see if he was still there. But the moment I moved, the hallway collapsed, the voices vanished, and the light flickered. And in that split second before everything went dark, there was a whisper from the woman. It was clear, soft, and certain. "Wake up." And then nothing. I opened my eyes, and I was back. Chapter 5, Last Call. I opened my eyes, and for a moment I wasn't sure where I was. The world was slow to return, like watching something develop in an old darkroom, shapes forming in the dim light, but not quite coming into focus. Then gradually the hum of a city at night, the weight of a chair beneath me, the feel of an old rotary phone in my hand. I was back in my office, sitting at my desk. The neon light outside my window pulsed against the glass, painting the room in flickering reds and blues. The rain had stopped. The bottle of whiskey on my desk was exactly where I had left it, and the clock on the wall, 2:14 a.m., the same time as before. My breath slowed. I looked down at the phone in my hand. The receiver was pressed against my ear, and someone was on the line. The static was soft at first, curling through the speaker like a whisper of wind through an open door. Then a voice. Not mine, not hers. Someone else, a man's. It was calm and steady, like he had been waiting for me to wake up. "This is where we leave you." I gripped the receiver tighter. "Who is this?" I asked. The voice didn't answer, not right away. A pause stretched between us, long enough for me to hear my own breathing, long enough for me to wonder if I had imagined it. Then he spoke again. "You already know." And the line went dead. I stayed like that for a long time, the phone in my hand, the dial tone humming softly in my ear. Then slowly, I lowered the receiver, placing it back in its cradle. Everything looked the same, but it wasn't. The air felt different. It was thicker, heavier, charged, like something had shifted just beneath the surface of reality, a ripple moving through a still pond. I stood, the chair creaked beneath me, the sound too sharp in the silence. I moved to the window, looking down at the city below. The streets stretched exactly as they should have. But the people walking them, they weren't moving right. They were too slow, too synchronized, like a film playing at the wrong speed, like something going through the motions of being real. I swallowed. The light from the liquor store across the street flickered. It was the same open sign that had been there since I moved into this office. But now, something was off about it. The sign still blinked, still pulsed in steady red, but the letters, they didn't spell open. Instead, they spelled no one. I blinked once, then again. The letters hadn't changed. There was a sound behind me. It was soft, like footsteps moving over old carpet. I turned, and the office door stood open. Not to the hallway I had walked through 1,000 times, not to the flickering fluorescence and chipped linoleum of my building's 3rd floor, but to a hotel hallway with faded wallpaper and damp carpet. Dim, flickering emergency lights cast shadows against closed doors. This was a hallway I had walked before, a hallway I had never left. I stepped forward, my breath steady. My heartbeat slowed because now I understood. I hadn't come back. I had never left. I walked down the hallway, past doors I recognized but had never seen before tonight, and at the end, a room. 1603. The door stood open. I stepped inside. The lamp on the nightstand flickered. The rotary phone sat beside it. The receiver was off the hook. A dial tone hummed softly, and across the room was the same woman as before, with her dark hair and pale skin. But this time, she wasn't standing in the shadows. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap, watching me. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to, because now I understood. I knew what this was. I swallowed and slowly asked, "How long?" She tilted her head, the motion slow. "How long have I been here?" A pause, then, softly she said, "Longer than you think." I exhaled. The neon light from outside leaked in through the curtains, painting her face in streaks of red and blue. And then she lifted her hand, a slow and careful motion. It wasn't a wave, nor was it a warning, but a farewell. And the world slipped. I woke up, for real this time, maybe. The city stretched before me, endless and dark. I was where I had always been, where I would always be. The phone on my desk rang once, then fell silent. I let it ring, and I decided this time I wouldn't answer.
The story has come to its end, and as the night embraces you, let your mind drift into quiet dreams. Rest easy, breathe deeply, and surrender to sleep. Until next time, good night.